Hello, everyone. It is noon Eastern. We are just going to give folks another minute or two to jump on. Thank you for being here with us today on this Lunch and Learn, and we'll get started soon. All right, we're just going to get started in 15 seconds here as I pull up the PowerPoints. All right, Dr. Levine or Casey, can you see my shared screen here?
Yes.
Okay. I am going to go ahead and get started then. Make sure I have everything. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joshua Long. I am the Senior Educational Content Manager here at the Indiana Youth Institute. And thank you for joining us today. We are in for an incredible day of learning around a topic that intersects the most important work of helping children and families thrive. You'll hear from an amazing speaker and be able to share valuable takeaways that you can bring to the kids, families, and communities that you serve. I do have some general reminders. There are CEUs available today. If you want to receive one CEU offered, please change your Zoom name to your full name so we can track your attendance in each session. Let me just say that again. If you would like a CEU, we need you to change your Zoom name so that we can track your attendance. So change it to the name that matches the name that you registered for the webinar on. For those needing CEUs, the survey links will be included in the chat at the end of the event. You must complete the survey in order to get a CEU certificate. Please take note that there are two different links and click the one that applies to you. Closed captioning is available for all sessions. You can access it in the bottom bar or hit the three dots and select the third option. Hit the CC button. And if you have any questions, we have a team of folks from the Indiana Youth Institute in the webinar today, so please enter them in the chat. Additionally, we encourage you to engage in the chat throughout the section. The chat is a great place to make connections, build on what you're learning, and ask questions. And if you do have a question for the speaker, we encourage you to ask them or enter them in the chat, and someone from IYI will relay that to Dr. Levine. Now, I would like to introduce our speaker for the afternoon, Dr. Phillip B. Levine. Dr. Levine is the A. Barton, Hepburn, and Catherine Cohen Professor of Economics at Wesley College, a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research, and a member of the National Academy of Social Insurance. He has also served as senior economist at the White House Council of Economic Advisors. Dr. Levine received a Bachelor of Science degree with honors from Cornell University in 1985 and a PhD from Princeton University in 1990. He has been a member of the faculty at Wesley since 1991. He has written or co-authored dozens of journal articles and 5 books devoted to the statistical analysis of social policy and its impact on individual behavior. His latest book, A Problem of Fit: How the Complexity of College Pricing Hurts Students and Universities, analyzes the system of pricing in higher education and ways that we can change it to improve access. Levine is also the founder and CEO of My Intuition Corp., a nonprofit organization that supplies a vastly simplified financial aid calculator to dozens of colleges and universities. I also would just like to say, Dr. Levine's book, A Problem of Fit: How the Complexity of College Pricing Hurts Students, will be available to all that attend today for free. There'll be a survey link at the end that you have to fill out, and we'll have that shipped directly to your address. With that, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Dr. Levine. Dr. Levine, thank you for being with us here today.
Thanks, I'm glad I could be here. Let me get my setup in order here. So first, let's get some video, and then I want to share my screen. Share. And can you see my screen?
Yep, we're good to go.
Okay, great. Let's get started then. Yeah, so this is my book, A Problem of Fit. I'll just share with you, this was my COVID project. So my kids are grown now. So when COVID hit and I was stuck home for, months at a time with, not a lot else to do, I wrote a book, which is this one. So I've been, spending time thinking about college pricing and financial aid for several years now, and I'll talk more about that as we go along. And this is pretty much a collection of my thoughts. So let's get started with, sort of broad goals and, policy initiatives, things that we would like to think that are, would be great outcomes for American society. And something that I think, pretty much everybody can agree on, regardless of where you are in the political spectrum. The concept of the American dream is something that I think everybody sort of believes in. It should be the case that, regardless of where you start at birth, you should have the ability to climb the ladder, to do whatever it is that you're capable of doing. You should have all of those options available to you. And the concept of social mobility is something that I think pretty much everybody really believes in. We like to think that higher education is an important component in providing that social mobility for those students who are able to take advantage of it. Going to college and graduating from college provides you with that ability to rise on the ladder and to climb those rungs. And that's great as a goal. The problem is that in our society, we don't completely accomplish that all that well. And how do I know that? Well, one way that you can tell for sure that, that I'm right about this is there's just lots of organizations out there who are fighting very hard to help make it easier for people, particularly from lower levels of the income distribution, to get them to be able to take advantage of the benefits that a college education can provide. These are just a few of the organizations that are out there, and you've probably, maybe have heard of some of these and perhaps some others. Perhaps you work for one. The fact that there's an entire system of helping to provide that support suggests that we're not doing a great job on our own. Like, we need help. So that gets me to sort of the concept of the book that I wrote, which is called A Problem of Fit. So first of all, what do I mean by a problem of fit? If you think about it, basically, not everyone has the same goals, abilities, characteristics, whatever. And, for different people, there's a good fit school for everybody. So, for the most talented, most gifted students, Harvard is a great option, but not everybody belongs to be going to Harvard, should be going to Harvard. For others, flagship public institution is just a great outcome. It's exactly where they belong. Others still, a community college provides them exactly what they need. And maybe even for others still beyond that, like maybe college isn't right at all, and going to a trade school or whatever is a great outcome for them. But basically, regardless of who you are, there's sort of a right fit school for you, which also may include no school. The goal of the system should be to make sure that everybody has access to the school that's a good fit for them. If that doesn't occur, we're making mistakes as a society. And so basically what I'm arguing in this book, probably isn't a surprise to many people, is that we sort of fail in that regard, that we face this problem of fit. So why not? there's lots of reasons why not, and we can sit here generating lists about what the problems are that, you know, provide hurdles and obstacles for people that prevent them from accomplishing that goal. You know, we had problems in our K through 12, inequities in our K through 12 education system. You know, how you figure out the college going process is complicated. It helps a lot if, for instance, your parents went to college, perhaps they can help. But if your parents didn't go to college, maybe they did, you know, have more difficulties providing that help. There's the, you know, filling out the forms and writing the essays themselves. What are people looking for? Like I said, I think we can generate quite a long list of all the hurdles that people face in the college going process. What I want to focus on in my discussion today and what I talk about in my book is exclusively the concept of college pricing. So how is it that college pricing, how is it that the system of college pricing hinders the fit that we all want? And I would argue that, in essence, that's the first hurdle that students have to overcome. If you can't get over the pricing problem, if you can't afford to go to college, it doesn't matter what your knowledge is. It doesn't matter any of the other hurdles that come along in your path. You have to be able to get over that one. I would argue it's the most important one. It has to be the case that college is affordable for everybody. I will say, by the way, that these broad concepts are relevant at any institution, but the specific examples and the specific discussion that I'm going to talk about today mostly is about traditional college-age students, so 18-year-olds who are dependents and attending four-year residential institutions. We can sort of talk about, like, you know, expanding beyond that, but that's mostly the focus of my book. So what is it that I do in the book? A lot of it is just documenting the problem. And so what is the problem, or what are the problems? And I basically point to really two aspects of it. The first is that mostly what people focus on in the sticker is the sticker price. And the sticker price is a terrible indicator of what people have to pay for college. Most people don't pay the sticker price. Financial aid is available. The vast majority of students receive some form of financial aid. If you don't know that, and if you're focused on the sticker price, that's a problem. Basically, you think college is more expensive than it really is. You are going to make decisions accordingly, and those decisions may not be the right decisions. I'll talk a lot about that. The other thing that I want to focus on, so basically, you know, that first point is college is cheaper than many people think, and that's an important point we need to communicate. But it's still the case that even if you did have perfect information, even if you did know exactly what college was going to cost you, it still is the case that for many students, and particularly for lower income students, college is still too expensive. And we need to be able to fix that problem. So in the book, I spend a extensive amount of real estate sort of documenting and identifying all of those sorts of problems. I also go on to talk about sort of the economics in the marketplace, about why those outcomes exist, and then to talk about potential solutions to those problems. Given the nature of the talk and the audience that's here today, those last 2 points I'm happy to talk about and take questions at the end, but that's less about what I will focus on during my discussion, during my formal remarks. Okay, so step number one is the financial aid process. Basically, if you have to have some elementary understanding of how the financial aid system works to sort of understand any of the details that I want to talk about afterwards. The problem is that the financial aid system is incredibly complicated. Here I found this nice slide. Google, you can find anything on Google. And I found this one slide that talks about, here's the description of the college financial aid process. And I love the fact that this is what you're supposed to show your seniors as a high level overview of how the system works. Because basically when I'm looking at this, like my eyes are getting blurry looking at this thing, and I basically do understand how the financial aid system works. This is not helpful. I'm going to get the financial aid system and cut it down to its most basic elements and describe really like how the financial aid system works, how it is we should think about it, and how it is we need to be able to communicate it to others. the basic component of the system is that financial aid is based on families' income and assets. So students fill out the FAFSA, and at some institutions, the CSS profile as well. And the purpose of those forms is to insert into a formula all of every nickel's worth of income that you have available to you, and many of your assets. And you stick those numbers onto the forms. It gets run through a formula. At the end of the formula, you get the statistic called the EFC. The EFC is the expected family contribution, which has a name that basically makes no sense, and it's being changed, but like that's what we label it. What the expected family contribution really is it's trying to communicate to schools how much the family and the student can afford. And you'll notice that I have afford in quotation marks, because how much a family can afford, affordability is not a simple concept. You know, if you know everything about a family, like how much the family can afford, basically this is about counting other people's money. How much a family can afford is something that's extremely hard to, you know, estimate precisely, but the system does it anyway. I'm going to talk about the EFC as if it really is how much you can afford, because that is how the financial aid system uses your EFC. Expected family contribution almost makes it sound like that's how much you're going to pay, but at most schools that isn't how much you're going to pay. And partly it's because there's loans and work study, but partly it's because most schools expect you to pay more than you can afford anyways. And that's the distinction between schools that meet full need and other institutions. Schools at which you meet full need, you would pay exactly your expected family contribution. You would add in potentially student loans. You would add in potentially work study. All of those payments constitute what's called a net price. At schools that don't meet full need, it would be all of that plus extra. You have to pay, even on top of that, you'd have to pay more. And basically that's the number that matters. It's your net price. So your EFC is what you can afford. The net price is what you pay. That's the financial aid system. All right, so what does college really cost? Well, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about how we talk about how much college really costs, which may not be correct, but we'll talk about that in a minute. So media reports of the rising cost of college, you've all seen these stories. Like they're incredibly pervasive in the media. You don't have to look hard to see stories about how college costs are rising exponentially, placing college out of reach of typical households. So here's a quote: colleges have already begun to price themselves out of the American dream. Access to higher education, a hallmark of an open society, is being threatened by rising college costs. The rising costs and limited grants are narrowing higher education's ability to serve as a bridge, leading low-income and particularly minority youngsters into the middle class. If we go on this way for another 25 years, we won't have an affordable system of higher education. I know you've seen quotations like that. And I will also tell you that every single one of these quotations comes from the New York Times, same source. Last one was from 2016. The one before that was from 2001. The one before that was from 1987. And the one before that goes all the way back to 1973. Something has to be wrong with the way we're thinking about college costs, because it can't be the case that the sky has been falling for 50 years. That just doesn't make sense. There has to be something wrong with the way we're thinking about college costs to have this, these mistaken beliefs about what college costs for at least the last several decades. At this point, from what I've said, you probably will you know, be able to guess the answer. And the answer is that college costs are not the sticker price. Most people don't pay the sticker price. So here's a statistic from a Chronicle of Higher Education opinion piece I wrote earlier this year. So over 85% of freshmen attending four-year residential colleges receive some form of financial aid. That number is higher at private institutions. So the only number that gets typically reported, the fact that public institutions cost something like $30,000, Elite private institutions cost something like $80,000. Those are the numbers we have in our heads. And those numbers are correct if you're paying full price. And, roughly 1 in 6 people are paying full price. Everybody else, the 5 out of 6, is paying less than that. So if you're focusing your college decision on the $30,000 or the $80,000, you are making a mistake. That's not what college costs. Those are the prices that are rising astronomically, that get all of the attention, that apply to basically nobody. So how much do families think college costs? Well, perhaps not surprisingly from this discussion, they think college costs a lot more than it actually does. Here's some statistics on surveys that if you ask people what do they think college costs and compare it to what it actually does cost. At 4-year public institutions 20 years ago, or 25 years ago, people would overestimate college costs at public institutions by basically double, and almost 40% more than it really costs at private institutions. That hasn't changed in 20 years after that. And what's interesting about that is that, like, public policies have changed. We've introduced these things called net price calculators, which I'll talk more about later on in the discussion. Those have been introduced in the intervening period, and it hasn't changed the extent to which people overestimate college costs. People think college costs way more than it actually does. If you ask students about college pricing, around half of college students, the only number they know is the sticker price, the $30,000 and the $80,000, which is not how much they have to pay. So the only number that most people know is the number that does not apply to them. That's a problem. So what we've documented so far is that people think college is much too expensive relative to what it actually costs them. I'm sorry, that college is much more expensive than what it actually costs them. That still leaves the question, though, is it affordable in the first place? If you knew the right amounts, what do colleges charge relative to what you can afford? Well, sometimes a statistic that you see people report that's trying to fix that problem is they'll report something called an average net price. On average, what do students at college X pay? Maybe it's not the $80,000 sticker price or the $30,000 sticker price. Maybe it's a number more like $20,000 or $30,000. And on average, that's what our students pay. And that's great if you're the student with the average finances. But like one student at the institution has those finances. That's not really all that helpful either. Here's the question that you want to know the answer to. How much do I have to pay? That's the only number that you care about. It doesn't matter what anyone else has to pay. You're not making decisions based on what they have to pay. You're making decisions on what you have to pay. What we really need is a system that does a better job of characterizing individual net prices, the prices that you would pay given your finances. I tried to characterize that, and believe me, this was not a simple undertaking. I used these tools called net price calculators, which again were introduced a little over a decade or so ago by federal law. Net price calculators were methods where you can stick in your own finances and get back an estimate of how much you would have to pay. The idea is exactly right. The implementation is a little bit problematic because those tools are not simple to use. I did that, though, for a bunch of families with specific characteristics, and the families at a bunch of different institutions. This, like I said, this was not a simple exercise. Basically, I hired a research assistant to spend an entire month doing this. I chose families at the 10th, 25th, 50th, 75th, and 90th percentiles of the income distribution. These are how much they make at those percentiles. And then I applied to them the typical asset values that families in those positions and the income distribution typically hold using federal data sources. I then ran all of those numbers through net price calculators at 200 institutions. And at those 200 institutions with 5 income levels, that's 1,000 times I did a net price calculator computation. If you've ever done one of those computations, you will know this was no minor task. I did this for 4 different categories of schools. I call them, so they have schools that have large endowments. A large endowment, I have quotation marks around them because it was defined as, I think the cutoff was $150,000 of endowment per student, which includes, institutions like Wabash College, which that's a large endowment, but that's not what Harvard has. Harvard has way more than that. So, large endowment is a very broad range. I have other private institutions, and then public flagships and R1 institutions. So what does that mean? What's the R1? That means that like Berkeley, which is the flagship in California, UCLA obviously is an elite institution as well. It can get categorized as a high research institution, which is what R1 means, but it's not a public flagship. So it's all of those sorts of schools, Texas, University of Texas, Texas A&M, like that. And then other four-year public institutions. So not the flagship and not the R1 institutions in the state. So what is this slide showing? So then I wanted to generate an indication of how much students can afford to pay, which again, afford is always going to have quotation marks around it. It's based on what FAFSA tells you, basically. And so you'll notice that on the x-axis, it says afford to pay, which is your expected family contribution. So I have families ranked from having a 0 EFC. So those families basically can't afford to pay anything. Although I stopped at $90,000 of an EFC because that goes beyond what most schools charge. All schools charge. On the x-axis, you'll notice this is the net price. It's how much you have to pay. And that's going to include both an assumed $5,500 loan and a $2,500 work study, because those are typical values. Some schools have lower amounts than that. Work study, $2,500 is a very common amount for a work study level. Some schools have lower loan expectations, and students can borrow more, but in terms of the financial aid package, they just assume a $5,500 loan. So you'll notice that if you're a 0 EFC family, means you can't afford to pay anything in terms of cash. It's still affordable, quote unquote, if the school asks you to take out the $5,500 loan and the $2,500 in work study. That's an $8,000 net price. Okay. So I'm determining affordability for the 0 EFC family is having an $8,000 net price. Everything else then goes up from there. If you can afford $10,000, you'd have an $18,000 net price, because we're going to add the $8,000 on top of that. And that this linear line, this blue line with the dots, that's how much you can afford to pay. That's sort of a baseline. And if you're a school that meets full need, that's what you would charge your students with these loan packaging and work study assumptions.
Dr. Levine, can I ask a quick clarifying question that came through?
Yeah.
Is this annual or total time in college?
Annual.
Annual. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, it is annual. So if you're a 0 EFC student, every year they would ask you to take a $5,500 loan and a $2,500 work study job. Actually, so the loan burdens go up a little tiny bit when you're juniors and seniors, but as a rough approximation, this is correct. So this is annually. So you're asked to pay 0 EFC, you'd be asked to pay $8,000 per year. This is the baseline of comparison for what schools are going to be charging and what my net price calculator exercise is going to be calculating. And we want to use this comparison to see how do what schools charge stack up to what you could conceivably afford. So my first slide is high endowment private institutions. And so these institutions actually do a pretty good job. So for the lowest income families, they're charging, their net price is about, so basically the blue line is what they charge, the darker blue line, the aqua line is, what they can afford. So the fact that they're pretty close, certainly through the median, means that basically schools are charging students what they can afford to pay. And that's probably not that surprising because many of these schools are meet full need institutions. It gets a little bit lower at the 75th percentile. And out here in the higher income students, they actually they pay a little bit less than what they could afford. And the reason why you get some of that, why they're being charged less than meeting full need, is because basically many of these, or some of these institutions are providing merit aid on top of their financial aid. And that's what's lowering the cost below the meet full need standard. That's what high endowment private schools charge. Here's what public flagships charge. For them, we see the affordability problem. So the zero EFC student who really can't afford to pay anything in cash, we're going to assume that they can afford the $8,000 loan in the work study, and then they're still asked to pay another roughly $7,000 on top of that they can't afford. So their net price is a number like $15,000. They don't have $15,000. $8,000 of it is borrowed and earned. They certainly don't have the $7,000 that they're expected to come up with in the form of cash. The higher income students, though, are doing great, right? So the fact that they're charged $30,000 a year, that's for the median student, that's about what they can afford to pay. Beyond that, though, the higher income students are getting a really good deal. So there's a lot of subsidies going on here at the higher end of the income distribution. Other public institutions, the not flagship and not the UCLAs and Berkeleys of the world, it's basically the same. You'll see in a minute that's largely the same profile, but a little bit lower. They charge a little bit less. This was in 2016 when or 2018 when I was doing this. And again, for the other public institutions, you'll notice that it's still the same gap of roughly seven. Financial aid people talk about this as a gap. There's a $7,000 roughly gap between what students can afford and what they're asked to pay. Other private institutions, it's actually even greater than that. The lower income students are asked to pay an amount roughly $20,000. And it's not as bad for the higher income students. And now they get a discount that's a lot greater. And just to give a simple answer for that, the other private institutions, basically, they can't afford to charge the lower income students as low a price because they don't have state aid and they don't have endowments that are as large to help fill in the gaps for the lower income students. And also they don't have a lot of additional revenue from the higher income students to subsidize the lower income students. They can't help it. Here's all of them all at once. Basically, the schools that are doing the best in these comparisons are the high endowment privates, despite what public perception would tell you. The alleged affordability of public institutions, they're not so affordable for lower income students. Where they are affordable is for higher income students. So where does that leave you? So I know that many of you are in the business of talking to students and families about like, how do they navigate this process? And so, what I want to do in the remaining parts of my formal talk is just like, if I had a student in front of me or family in front of me, what would I tell them? And I would tell them that there definitely still are affordability problems. I just documented that. We can't make those go away. Schools charge what they charge. But you at least need to know what they're really going to charge you relative to how much you think they're going to charge you. You have to do your homework to solve the perception problem or the misperception problem of college costs. Now, the other thing that I'm going to say to you is that you have to do your homework, but doing your homework here is not going to be easy. There's a considerable amount of work that's involved in solving this problem. The federal government has tried to help. They've developed tools trying to get at this notion that college is less expensive than people think. The first tool that they've introduced is this thing called the college scorecard. This is a tool that perhaps some of you have looked at and used in your own work. It's a step in the right direction, but it still has a lot of problems. So here's an example of the problem that I referred to earlier about talking about average annual cost. Well, the average annual cost is helpful in the sense that it will tell you that the average annual cost, the net price, on average is less than the sticker price. And so at the Bloomington campus of Indiana University, it tells you that the average net price is not the $30,000, whatever the sticker price is, but a number more like 14, more like half that. Wellesley College, where I work, we have a sticker price around $80,000. And the average annual cost, the average net price is not anywhere near that. it's 24,000. It should also tell you, by the way, that this is for people who are receiving federal financial aid. So if you're a financial aid recipient at Indiana, you're paying 14,000, and at Wellesley, you're paying 24,000. Brown University, it just shows as another example, 30,000. One of the things which I would tell you, which clearly is a problem, is that I know for a fact that Wellesley College and Brown University have virtually exactly the same financial aid system. This is just a function of the composition of the students on our campus and has nothing to do with a particular family at a certain income level. They pay basically the same at both campuses. So already you're starting to see these problems of just using average statistics isn't really all that helpful. You need to know more than that. What you want to know is, how much am I going to pay? Going further, you can, in the college scorecard, break up the data into how much you pay by family income. So this is roughly median income in the, for families in the United States. And now we're down to the fact that the University of Indiana, that Indiana University, the public institution, on average for these families, basically charges the same as Wellesley College and Brown University. A public institution isn't necessarily cheaper. You need to do your homework. What is the school really going to cost you? I would also say, though, that when you use these income statistics, they're a little bit problematic as well. Again, this says that Wellesley College charges $6,000 more. This is for a very low income. This is a zero EFC student. This family can't afford anything. We're a meet full need institution. We don't charge them $8,000. It would be more like what Brown charges them at $2,800. And Indiana University, again, this is the number that I gave before, that basically a zero EFC student still has to come up with $7,000 in cash. That is what they would have to pay. How do we solve this problem? That really what the answer is I want to know, what do I have to pay? Given my family's finances, what is college going to cost me? Well, when Josh introduced me, he talked about the fact that I'm the founder and CEO of this nonprofit organization called My Intuition Corporation, My Intuition Corp. And what we do is, and given the stories that I've been telling you here, I believe very firmly that what we need to do is solve this problem so that people give you very basic financial characteristics, and you can really easily get an estimate of what is college going to cost me. I've done that. I have about 75 schools that participate in My Intuition. Notre Dame is a school in Indiana that is one of my participants. I'm just going to show you a very quick example of how it works. It would work at the Notre Dame calculator. This is on the Notre Dame website and at myintuition.org. I'm going to ask if you're a citizen of a U.S. citizen, because financial aid policies differ depending on if you're a U.S. citizen. So I'm clicking on yes, because that's mostly what you'd be interested in anyway. There's issues about, at some institutions, there's issues about whether your parents are divorced and who's going to make payments if you have divorced parents. I'm going to choose the simpler case of living with both biological or adoptive parents. They don't have to be married, they just need to be living together. Or if you have a single parent, it would be basically the same thing. What was your family's total annual income before taxes? People don't understand taxes. If you ask them for things like your adjusted gross income, nobody knows what that means. Ask them what they made before taxes. I stuck in just an example of $50,000 a year. So this is, maybe the 30th percentile family or 40th percentile family. So it's, a below median family, but not very low income. And then I asked simple asset questions. Do you own the family? Does your family own the home in which you live, for instance? And then there's a bunch of yes, no questions. Low income families mostly don't have assets. They can click on no all the way through. And if you click on no all the way through, you're going to get this is the next screen. You're done. And so Notre Dame last year, this is last year's number, had a sticker price of $78,000. This family at $50,000 of income needs to come up with $2,200 in cash. They'd have a $2,500 loan at Notre Dame and a $2,850 work study commitment. So this would basically put them very close to the line that I showed you a lot earlier. This would communicate to a family very quickly how much they'd have to pay. It also suggests that, like, this is an estimate. It could be higher or lower. In this case, it could be as high as like $4,400. Maybe, some families pay outside the range, that this is the best estimate. Like a good range would be in this range, these values. What you would get out of that is the $50,000 family with no assets isn't going to pay anywhere near $80,000. And that's the goal. Get them off the sticker price. The sticker price is telling them nothing. It's actually providing them bad information. Another useful tool, and so that's great if you happen to be interested in one of the schools that my intuition works with. You can very quickly get your estimate. I'm trying to encourage more schools to participate, and that's sort of an ongoing goal. If it's not at a school that meets full need, a school that uses my intuition, I'm telling you, it's going to get harder. One tool that you can use is, there's a tool that used to be called the FAFSA Forecaster. It's a federal government tool, and I never can remember the website now, but if you just Google FAFSA Forecaster, it will take you here. It's a pretty easy method of getting your EFC. And some schools like Purdue has a net price calculator where if you know your EFC, it's not that bad. So if you went to the federal website, got your EFC, went to the Purdue website, stuck in your EFC, you can get an estimate. That's not so bad. Other schools don't have that. Indiana University is an example. They use a net price calculator that's a College Board product. It says, you can see in the URL that this is a College Board product. It's not simple. It gets you what you need, but it is not simple. And you're definitely going to get asked questions about things like your adjusted gross income that people don't know how to answer. You're going to have to take out your tax forms to do this. It's not that complicated, but it's not that simple. And if you want the number, you got to pay the price. It's as simple as that. Those, from my perspective, are the easiest ways to be able to communicate to your students how they should go about figuring out what college is going to cost them. The affordability problem, the fact that, like, even if you tell them the right price, it still can be too much. That's a structural problem that I don't have a simple solution for. We can talk about sort of policy solutions that can fix that, but this isn't going to help. And I think at that point, I will stop my formal presentation and take questions.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Levine, for that. That was all super helpful. For attendees that are on, I'm going to start going through some questions that I came up ahead of time, as well as some that were in the chat. But please continue to put questions in the chat as we are going through this. So the first one, there's a little bit of discussion around the difference between sticker price and net. And there's a question on who absorbs the difference in that cost. Is it the federal government? Is it the institution? Can you talk a little bit about that?
So then the sticker price, so basically the argument that I'm making is, for most people, the sticker price is an irrelevant number. You should ignore it. I mean, you have to be at a public institution. You need to be, if your family's income is above, you have to be about roughly above $125,000 in income before the sticker price is a meaningful number to you. At a public institution, at a private institution, it could be as much as $300,000. That's not most people. So for most people, the sticker price is an irrelevant number. The net price that you have to pay is what you have to pay, including the loans and the work study. The fact that there is a gap between the net price and what you can actually afford, there's no simple solution to that problem. That's the affordability problem. That's what hinders college access. So you can search for outside scholarships, look for other sources of money. The financial aid system doesn't, if you have extended family members that can help, grandparents, aunts, uncles, whatever, like, the money's got to come from somewhere. Unfortunately, a lot of times where that money comes from is extra loans. And to the extent that it comes from extra loans, that helps contribute to the debt problem that we face. That people end up borrowing more than they can afford, in essence, because we make them. We don't charge a low enough price in the first place. And so regardless of what you thought of, last week's or 2 weeks ago's, whatever, introduction of the debt cancellation policy, regardless of whether he has a good idea or a bad idea, doesn't solve the underlying problem that college isn't affordable in the first place. That's the problem we really need to solve.
Yeah, and that kind of leads me to a question that I previewed for you. But it seems like there's two different things here, right? There's the system that seems to be a problem, and then there are the folks, many of which are on the call, that are trying to operate within the broken system itself. And so when we talk about information gaps, like, it's my assumption that there's a point at which it doesn't matter how much information that a parent or a student has, they're still coming up against the equity barriers. And so what needs to happen to push beyond that?
So I think that is a very difficult obstacle for the family member or the counselor to overcome, because, as you say, it's a structural barrier, right? I mean, like, it hinders college access, period. And in terms of my goodness of fit, this is the thing that I care about the most. It's like, there's qualified students out there who don't attend Indiana University or Harvard University because they think they can't afford it. Sometimes, so actually Harvard has extremely generous financial aid, and basically the low income kids really would pay nothing to go to Harvard. But where that structural barrier exists, generally, and people find that, like, the institution that they really want to attend and are qualified to attend and should attend, they can't afford, and then they end up, perhaps going to a lesser institution that charges. There's nothing wrong with a community college if that's the right fit for you, but if it's not, you should be able to go to the four-year institution. And the same thing with people who don't go to college at all, who for them, perhaps the community college is exactly the right fit for them. And you get all of these problems of fit that like, basically, there's all this misallocation of resources, and that's something that is bad for society and the individuals involved. So the solution, the structural solution, is, to be quite honest, really not all that complicated. Really, like a simple policy of doubling the Pell Grant fixes a lot of this. Maximum Pell Grant right now is roughly $7,000. I just documented for you that pretty much the gap that many of these families face is about $7,000. If you double the Pell Grant, you just close the gap. That requires federal intervention. That's something that, people on the street can't fix. It's a structural problem that requires a structural solution, and the solution is to double the Pell Grant.
Yeah. I wish that simple solution was more easily possible, I suppose.
Unfortunately, the politics does not help.
Yeah. There was conversation earlier in the chat, specifically from Nicole, who said, for many students, parents are not assisting with educational expenses, but their income is required to determine the affordability for a student. And then it was followed up by, not to mention the fact that so many from two-income households make too much to get sufficient aid, but not enough to satisfy their EFC. So what do we do about that problem, where it's maybe working class families that do not have a zero EFC, but still don't have enough to make up the difference?
So, I think in essence, basically, there's what does it mean to be affordable, right? I definitely tried, there's quotation marks every place I use the term affordable. I had quotation marks because it's not an obvious term. The FAFSA implicitly determines what affordability means. What the right formula is to convert income and assets into an amount that is affordable for different families is a process, and perhaps that's a process that needs to be revisited. But somewhere along the line, here's what I will say. So it's clearly a difficult problem to get that number exactly right, but we need that number. Right? There has to be a number in the system that says, we think this is what you can afford, because that's how financial aid decisions need to be made. If we can just get that number right, then we know how much we need to give you, quote unquote. If you don't have that number, you can't provide financial aid. So in essence, that's a problem about which also just raises then there's philosophical problems. You raise, well, what happens if you have parents who, your parents make $150,000, but they're unwilling to help you pay for your tuition. So now that's a very difficult philosophical problem, because so if you say, well, we're just going to ignore their income, well, now you just convinced a lot of parents to, not offer anything in terms of support. But in some situations, obviously, there's like legitimate constraints about getting your parents to pay. I don't have a simple solution to that problem. That, like I said, I think that is largely a philosophical one.
Yeah. Maybe a lot of these are philosophical. So here's a kind of specific question that you probably don't have a specific answer to, but I'm still going to read it. So a student with a high GPA, but their parents make over 100,000. Does it make more sense for those students to be looking at private institutions rather than public?
I think that in terms of financial aid, so I'll give you both a detailed answer and a philosophical answer, both in the same breath. The detailed answer, the specific answer is, in terms of financial aid, it's probably the case that the price isn't going to be a lot different for you. That for the family you just identified, going to a private institution and going to a public institution is roughly the same, despite the fact that, again, you need to get past the perception issue, because the perception issue would tell you that probably the public is cheaper. That's probably not true for the family that you just described. The philosophical issue is like, well, what's the right institution for you in this sort of, perfect fit world? Public institutions tend to be larger. They tend to have, a greater depth of offerings of, fields of study. Classes are probably going to be larger. From a faculty member at a small institution with small classes, you get to know your students more. There's trade-offs there. And what's right for you is the philosophical question. But I think for that family that you just described, it's probably not a financial question. So that would be in the instance of, like, you need to sort of investigate, like, visit the campuses, see what seems like would work for you, and what would be better and what would not be as good. That's true. I think, that fit notion, like, private institutions, the not elite private institutions, the private institutions that don't have massive endowments, charge more. Does that necessarily make it a mistake to attend those? Absolutely not. They offer attributes that public institutions don't have. And again, so now you're in the philosophical discussion of what's the right fit for you and what works for you and your family. And that I can't solve. And
then even going further down the philosophical route, right? Like, if we're thinking about equity, if a family is having to make a decision about best fit more based on finances than another family who might be middle income or upper income, then is it true choice? Which I think is
so that's definitely, that's one of the reasons why I wrote this book. And I think, we clearly have an inequitable system. There's obvious inequities in our higher education system that, regardless of the affordability problem, that the 100,000, we can quibble about what's the right way to measure affordability for the $100,000 family. The $30,000 or $40,000 family, they can't afford college in our current system. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. We make it too expensive for them. And there's significant inequities there.
Gotcha. So there's been a couple of comments based on some things that Indiana has. And so I'll talk a little bit about them, but maybe you can sort of comment on maybe some programs or policies that have been helpful or may be helpful in the future. Lori brought up our 21st Century Scholars Program in Indiana. It's based on family income and provides 4 years full tuition at state public colleges. Purdue's been really interesting as far as tuition freezes and their Back a Boiler program, which is an investment-based student loan. And then outside of Indiana, in Kalamazoo, Michigan, And then in Indiana, in the city of Hammond, they both have scholarship programs that are run. Hammond's through the city government, and then Kalamazoo's through a private foundation. So it seems like there are a lot of, I mean, you saw it in the beginning slide, there are a ton of organizations and foundations and people doing a lot of work. So what's good? What is helping? What should organizations and governments continue to push forward on?
So I think a lot of the times the misperceptions in college costs filter into public policy, that where policies that seem like they are doing the right thing don't really get at the underlying problem. Now, so I don't know the details of the 21st Century Scholarship Program, but from the way you described it, I'll interpret it as providing free, like you said, free tuition.
Yeah, and it's you have to sign up in 8th grade, and you have to get certain grades, and you have to stay out of trouble, that kind of thing.
So free tuition is the vast majority, if not all of your expenses, if you attend a community college, or if you attend a 4-year institution and live at home. Many of your institutions in Indiana are 4-year residential institutions. And so, you know, and just to make the numbers easier, I'm going to approximate here. This is probably exactly right. That's close enough. That, you know, if the institution has a $30,000 sticker price because $15,000 is tuition and $15,000 is room and board because you need to live, you just provided a scholarship of $15,000. Where's the other $15,000 going to come from? And if you're a low-income family, you didn't give them enough money. If you're a middle-income family, you gave them enough money. That's an excellent middle-income program. It does not address the inequities of the bottom part of the distribution being able to attend a 4-year residential institution. My guess is, I don't know anything about the specific policy, but like you need to be able to supplement that with need-based aid that goes beyond the free tuition, which would allow them to go to the university, to Indiana University, essentially for free, because that's the goal. If the family's making $30,000 a year and you're charging them really anything, they can't go, period. You need to go beyond just the free tuition. That's policy number one. Policy number two is the Purdue policy of holding the line on not allowing the tuition to rise. So again, there's issues about tuition and total expenses there, but the underlying problem of that policy sounds great. It's based on a misperception of what college, how you figure out college costs. If you're not receiving financial aid, you just got a windfall. Basically, for the family that actually is paying $30,000 and will continue to pay and Indiana families paying the full price will continue to pay $30,000. The fact that their incomes are rising with inflation and going beyond that isn't incorporated into that policy. And what that does is it restricts revenue to the institution. They don't get enough money. And what happens when the institution doesn't get enough money is the money's got to come from somewhere. They now no longer have enough money for financial aid for the lower income students. So what research essentially shows is that when institutions institute policies like you described, they cut back on financial aid for lower income students. So your policy that just made, so basically what that college is what that policy is a policy that makes college more affordable for upper income students and less affordable for lower income students. That seems like a bad policy to me. And then the third one, so well, you had mentioned in our earlier comments that some of these policies, the city-based policies, you have
and in the city of Hammond, they have a program called College Bound, where if you are a homeowner in the city, and it's prorated based on the number of years you've owned, but they will pay the tuition for all of your kids at an Indiana public school.
So again, there's problems of tuition and total expenses. I would argue this one's probably has maybe more problematic because you have to be a homeowner. Low-income people generally don't own their homes. So now you're up. So basically, you just provided a benefit for middle-income families. And it may even be a little bit worse than that, because not only did you just rule out lower income families from receiving the benefits, just middle income families, but then there's racial gaps in home ownership even among middle income families, for largely historical reasons, and structural historical reasons. So there's sort of a racial element involved in that as well. So that also, here's the bottom line. What we need to do is find ways to provide support for college attendance by lowering the price for lower income students. I understand that middle income students face difficulties. I'm willing to talk about those issues as well. The difficulties that they face are nowhere near as great as what lower income students face. And if we are going to accomplish this goal of, enabling upward mobility for everybody, and we have a system which structurally prevents college attendance for lower income students, that's something we need to fix.
Yeah. FAFSA has been brought up a number of times in the chat as well. And I think, I could be wrong, but I think they are updating FAFSA in the future to make it a little more simpler. But
we'll see.
hopefully. I remember being in this work and working with students, and you're working with a low income student who wants to go to college, and they fill out their FAFSA, and the government then asks them to verify. Well, if mom is passed away and dad's in prison, it makes it a lot more complicated. So there's a number of structural barriers before you can even get to thinking about financial fit. How much knowledge do you have of that, or can you comment on that?
I think it's actually worse than that, because you're telling me that FAFSA is problematic because it's hard to verify for some students. I'm telling you that FAFSA, if you simplify FAFSA, let's assume, we'll be gracious and assume that they actually do simplify the form in a way that makes it easier for students to fill it out. I'm skeptical still, but we'll see. The FAFSA tells you your EFC. They're changing the name of the EFC too, because for some reason giving the term of affordability one label that you don't understand, and you change it to a different label that you don't understand. The student aid index, which is what it's being changed to, somehow that's better. It's the same thing. If you know your EFC, that does not tell you how much you will pay for college. Unless you attend an institution that meets full need, your EFC doesn't tell you anything. You need to know more than your EFC, and colleges won't tell you how much you're going to have to pay based on your EFC easily. That is still a hard number for anyone to know. So simplifying the FAFSA makes it easier to fill out the form, but it doesn't make it easier to fill out how much college is going to cost you. For everybody, not just those who have difficulty verifying their income.
Yeah. Also, just philosophically, like the IRS and FAFSA are both government agencies. Like, I feel like they should be able to talk or something.
Talking would be good. But still, so even if you could fix that problem, what you want the system to do is press on a button. It'll automatically convert all of your income that you killed yourself to fill out for the 1040 form, automatically dump it into the FAFSA form. And there are steps moving in that direction. That would be great. But what I'm arguing is that's still not good enough, because that's not what you're going to pay.
Yep. Zooming out a little bit, I know I'm zooming out and zooming in. There's obviously President Biden just did the $10,000 student loan forgiveness. Do you foresee any other big structural policies or changes looming in the future? And I ask that because it seems like, if the solution is to double Pell Grants, do you think that's on the horizon anywhere, or should we be focusing our time on, again, fixing that information gap and learning to operate best within the system?
So 100% we should be working on overcoming this information gap, because that definitely affects what people are going to pay. They need better information. And that is definitely still a goal. And I continue to work with my intuition, hopefully to expand the number of schools that I work with, because I think that that's hopefully part of the solution. Beyond that, though, in terms of this, how there's still the underlying affordability problem. I think it's sort of interesting, from a personal perspective. I've been talking about doubling the Pell Grant as a solution to this problem for, a few years now, at least. In 2020, following the election, I would have, conversations with people about doubling the Pell Grant, and I'd get a response like, "Oh, that's really interesting. We should push towards doing that." And now when I talk to people about doubling the Pell Grant, I get a response of like, "Well, that sounds great, but that's never going to happen." Which I think is sort of a depressing development, because I do think that that is the solution. Hopefully, optimistically, maybe there might be some point in the future where we do have the ability to overcome our political problems, to introduce policies that can accomplish the goals that we seek to accomplish. I don't think that's happening tomorrow, 2024. Keep our fingers crossed. But, in my mind, that's the solution. The loan repayment policy had this, I don't want to talk about the strengths and weaknesses of the specifics of the loan repayment policy, but there's this new income-based repayment aspect, the change to those policies, but essentially are retroactively trying to make college cheaper later, so that you borrow a lot of money up front and then you don't repay a lot of the money. That has the equivalent effect of like making college cheaper. Well, why don't we just make college cheaper? Call me crazy, but it seems like we should use the simple solution.
Gotcha. Nicole said institutions could offer scholarships that match the Pell Award for needs-based students. So in other words, putting the burden on universities to fill that Pell Grant gap that you talked about. So,
at that point, they don't have the money to do that. So in essence, what I would argue is that what I want to see happen, and what I talk about in my book, is that if you double the Pell Grant, it will give schools the money to be able to fill in that gap, and then you can require them to meet full need, which is exactly what this person just suggested. So what we want is to get them to meet full need. They don't have the money to meet full need, which is why they don't in the first place now. If you give them the money and you force them to meet full need, that's a system that works.
Yeah. Yep. So as we finish up, I think and I mentioned it earlier, but I think the frustrating thing for a lot of folks that are working with teenagers and parents and helping them go to college is, again, that this financial decision is such a lever for the decision-making process. We didn't get into labor shortages and specific to Indiana, and how we have a need for, there's 6,000 new jobs that need computer science majors in Indiana that aren't filled every year. We didn't take into account happiness or mental health and what a college degree does for folks that want to be happy and fulfilled. And so we appreciate all the help with helping folks navigate that financial side of it, because ultimately we hope it would be less of a burden in that decision-making process. And so I will leave with that, but Dr. Levine, any sort of last minute final wrap-up type stuff, and while you're doing that, I'll include the links for the surveys in the book as well.
Sure. Yeah. So just to follow up on that last point that you made, from my perspective, this is a win-win. Providing more financial aid is a win-win. You both improved the ability, you increased social mobility and created a more equitable system. And as an economist, you just improved our ability to perform economically, because you took a whole bunch of kids who otherwise aren't living up to their potential, so to speak, enabling them to do that. That's good for economic activity. So this is, I'm talking about, these are policies that are both good for the individual and good for society. It is a win-win.
Gotcha. Well, Dr. Levine, we will go ahead and wrap up. For the folks in attendance, thank you for the lively engagement, the discussion, the questions. It's a super interesting and relevant topic, especially for almost any youth worker. we serve a lot of different types of youth worker at the Indiana Youth Institute, but I was saying to Dr. Levine before that if you are serving juniors or seniors or even freshmen, sophomores in any way, you have to have some knowledge of this, because this is a decision that they're making and they trust you as their mentor, as their coach, as their teacher. And so you have to be able to help them with this. And so Dr. Levine, thank you again. I'm just going to pull up this PowerPoint really quick as a couple of last minute reminders, if I can find it. I don't know about you, Dr. Levine, but I've been operating on 3 screens, so.
I just have a very large monitor.
Okay, so it's the beginning, go here. For those needing CEUs, the Indiana University School of Social Work, the link is in the chat, as well as a couple of other ones. So please take a look at those and find out what you need. And then additionally, please click the link to get a free copy of Dr. Levine's book, A Problem of Fit: How the Complexity of College Pricing Hurts Students. It's a little bit more intense than the talk today, but I think it's really important for our counselors, for our youth workers to have access to that so they can help their youth and students make the best decision about really the rest of their lives. And then finally, just a quick plug, we have our big statewide conference in November. It's November 1st and 2nd. It's a Kids Count conference. It's our first time back in person for this since the pandemic. And I'm just super excited about our keynote speaker. It's LeVar Burton. Everyone knows him for something. For me, it was as a kid and Reading Rainbow. So please go to iwad.org and take a look at that. But with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen. I'm going to thank you, Dr. Levine, one more time. And I hope everyone has a great rest of their week.
Thank you.